The storm had left a haunting scar on the small coastal town. Uprooted trees lay sprawled across roads, boats were shattered against the cliffs, and the once pristine beach was littered with debris. But the most peculiar discovery came when the raging waters receded, revealing the entrance to a series of hidden underground tunnels carved into the cliffs beneath the old, abandoned lighthouse. The townsfolk were wary. Legends of the Forgotten Ones had circulated for generations, sailors who had vanished during treacherous storms, cursed to wander the earth in eternal torment. Most dismissed the tales as folklore, but some swore they had heard eerie wails carried by the wind on stormy nights. For Emily, Jake, Claire, and Nate, the tunnels were irresistible. Armed with flashlights, a couple of old maps, and a camera, the group set off just before dusk. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay as they descended into the labyrinth of stone and darkness. The first tunnel was narrow and damp, with water dripping from the jagged ceiling. Their flashlights cast long, dancing shadows against the walls, where strange, weathered carvings seemed to tell an incoherent story. Jake ran his fingers over one of the carvings, a series of crude figures with hollow eyes, bound by chains, being dragged beneath waves by skeletal hands. "Creepy," Claire muttered, hugging herself as a chill ran down her spine. "Do you think these are about the Forgotten Ones?" "Probably just old sailor stories," Nate replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's keep moving." The group pressed deeper into the tunnels, the light from the entrance quickly fading into an oppressive darkness. The air grew colder, and an unsettling silence enveloped them, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel floor. As they turned a corner, Emily suddenly froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The others stopped. At first, there was nothing but the sound of dripping water. Then, faintly, they heard it, a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo from all directions. "It's just the wind," Jake said, though his grip on the flashlight tightened. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was not the wind. It was a chorus of voices, anguished, pleading, and filled with despair. The group huddled closer, their breath visible in the icy air. A sudden gust extinguished Claire's flashlight, plunging them into near-total darkness. "Jake, turn yours this way," she hissed, panic rising in her voice. Jake's light flickered as he turned it toward her, revealing a figure standing just behind Claire. It was translucent, with hollow eyes and seaweed clinging to its skeletal frame. Its mouth gaped open in a silent scream. Claire spun around, but the figure had vanished. "We need to leave now," Emily said, her voice trembling. They turned back the way they had come, but the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly. The carvings on the walls grew more grotesque, depicting scenes of drowning, torment, and despair. The wails grew deafening, and the air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were closing in. "This isn't right," Nate said, his voice shaking. "We didn't come this far." "Keep moving," Emily urged, though she was barely holding herself together. The tunnel suddenly opened into a vast underground chamber. In the center stood a massive anchor, its rusted chain snaking across the floor. Around it were dozens of figures, their forms flickering like candle flames. They turned as one to face the intruders, their hollow eyes filled with malice. "You shouldn't be here," one of the spirits rasped, its voice like the crashing of waves. "This is our place. Our torment. And now, it is yours." The group bolted, sprinting back into the tunnels. But the path twisted and turned in ways they didn't recognize. Their flashlights began to flicker, and a bone-chilling wind howled through the passageways. Shadows danced along the walls, taking on grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for them. Claire was the first to fall. Something unseen yanked her into the darkness, her screams cut short. The others called her name, but only the wails of the Forgotten Ones answered. "We can't stop," Emily cried, dragging Jake and Nate forward. They stumbled into another chamber, smaller this time, with a narrow shaft of moonlight filtering through a crack in the ceiling. Beneath it lay a tattered journal, its pages brittle with age. Emily picked it up, flipping to a page that read, "Beware the tide. When the waters return, so do they." As if on cue, the sound of rushing water echoed through the tunnels. The tide was coming in, faster than they could escape. The walls began to seep with seawater, and the wails of the spirits turned to malicious laughter. "There!" Jake shouted, pointing to a faint light ahead. They ran toward it, hope surging through them. But as they reached the opening, they realized it was not the exit. It was the base of the lighthouse, its door swinging open to reveal a spiraling staircase. With no other choice, they climbed. The steps were slick and crumbling, and the air grew colder with each step. When they reached the top, they found themselves in the lantern room. The glass was shattered, and the light's mechanism lay in ruins. Outside, the storm had returned, waves crashing violently against the cliffs. "We're trapped," Nate whispered, his voice hollow. The spirits began to materialize, filling the room with their ghastly forms. Their hollow eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and their skeletal hands reached for the living. One by one, they closed in, their icy touch sapping the strength from Emily, Jake, and Nate. As the tide surged higher, the lighthouse groaned under the weight of the storm. The last thing Emily saw before darkness claimed her was the water crashing through the lantern room, carrying the spirits with it. Their laughter echoed in her ears, cruel reminder of their fate. When the storm passed, the lighthouse stood silent once more. The townsfolk found no trace of the group, only the tattered journal washed ashore, its final page scrawled with a chilling warning. "Beware the tide. The forgotten ones never let go."
The Shadows Chapel had loomed over the small, forgotten village of Ashridge for centuries. Abandoned after the tragic massacre of its parishioners during a stormy midnight mass, it was said that the church bore a curse so dark that even the wind avoided its bell tower. Locals whispered of the shadows that danced behind its shattered stained-glass windows, the faint cries of agony that echoed from its rotting pews, and the heavy presence that seemed to watch anyone who ventured too close. Father Gregory, a devout and steadfast priest, had heard these rumors but dismissed them as mere superstition. Recently assigned to the region, he felt it was his duty to cleanse the chapel and reclaim it for the church. Armed with his Bible, holy water, and unwavering faith, he arrived at the chapel on a cold, misty evening. As he pushed open the heavy wooden doors, a rancid smell wafted out, so putrid it made his stomach churn. The interior was decrepit, filled with overturned benches, crumbling walls, and a pulpit covered in years of dust. Despite the decay, Father Gregory pressed on, determined to begin his prayers. But as he moved closer to the altar, an unnatural chill enveloped the air. His breath fogged in front of him, and the once faint murmurs of the wind outside grew into distorted whispers. He paused, gripping his Bible tighter. The chapel seemed to exhale, the walls creaking as if alive. He shook his head, dismissing his unease, and began reciting prayers aloud. "Lord, bless this place and rid it of evil." Before he could finish, the whispers turned into wails. He spun around to find the pews filled with shadowy figures, their faces obscured but their hollow, empty eyes locked onto him. They swayed as if caught in an invisible tide, their murmurs overlapping into a cacophony of torment. Gregory's pulse raced as he backed away toward the altar, raising his crucifix. "Leave this holy ground, in the name of God," he commanded. The figures froze. For a moment, silence fell over the chapel. Then, one by one, the shadows began to stand, their movements jagged and unnatural. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the room as the largest shadow stepped forward. It pointed a gnarled, claw-like hand toward the altar, where Gregory now noticed a strange object half-buried beneath the debris. Overcome with dread yet driven by curiosity, Gregory moved cautiously toward the altar. He brushed away the rubble to reveal an unholy relic, a blackened, ornate dagger etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with an eerie, red glow. The moment his fingers grazed the blade, a deafening scream erupted from all directions. The shadows surged toward him, but an unseen force held them back, trapping them in the pews. Gregory's vision blurred as images flashed in his mind. He saw the chapel's final mass, the terrified parishioners locked inside as the deranged priest who once presided there raised the cursed dagger. Blood spilled like a river as he offered them to an ancient, malevolent entity buried beneath the chapel. Gregory dropped the dagger, gasping, as the realization struck him. The spirits weren't just trapped. They were imprisoned by the very entity they had been sacrificed to. The shadows began chanting in a guttural language, their voices rising in desperation. The dagger glowed brighter, and the ground beneath the altar cracked open, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness. A massive, clawed hand emerged, followed by an eyeless, horned head. The entity's presence was overwhelming, its mere appearance sapping the warmth and light from the room. Gregory fell to his knees, clutching his crucifix. "Lord, give me strength," he cried, tears streaming down his face. Summoning every ounce of his faith, he began to recite the Lord's Prayer, louder and louder, until his voice drowned out the creature's guttural growls. The shadows chanting faltered. The creature shrieked, recoiling as Gregory's prayers grew stronger. The vortex began to collapse, pulling the entity back into the abyss. But as the ground started to seal, the dagger flew into the air, hovering before Gregory. A deep, resonant voice echoed in his mind. "One must stay. The pact demands it." Gregory's heart sank. He realized the terrible truth. The chapel's curse could not be lifted unless someone took the place of the original priest as the entity's warden. He glanced at the shadows, their anguished faces now visible, silently pleading for release. With trembling hands, Gregory picked up the dagger. The shadows began to dissolve, their murmurs of gratitude fading into silence. The entity roared in fury as Gregory plunged the dagger into the ground, sealing the vortex completely. The chapel fell silent, the air heavy with finality. When the villagers found the chapel days later, they discovered it was miraculously restored, its walls pristine, its pews aligned, and its altar spotless. But Father Gregory was never seen again. Some say his voice can still be heard inside, whispering prayers to keep the darkness at bay. And on stormy nights, the bell tolls, though no one dares to see who rings it.